Daniel Tiwati ne chini chiche. And Kazangi Tiwati, Koragi Tiwati or Tiwati Kiribe. Lochi Kieva ina, the Yudi Yu me, Sidita Lodi Yanga Yimidamuro. And if Lodi Yanga Yima is the young Lodi Temashin, never you me, Dabuena. Yang Kindigi Temadi Yang Dawi Midamuro. Yang did the Temashin, you never you met up, Tindi Tumi Chatu, did the Russian.
Here the question that was asked yesterday, just double checking, was the question yesterday, the question that if something exists conventionally, if it is, it needs a valid cognizer, which then that does not contradict the existence of that object. So, but that valid cognizer, which therefore establishes the phenomenon, since it's not contradictory to that phenomenon, or doesn't contradict that, well, that valid cognizer needs another valid cognizer, and that valid cognizer needs another one, so there seems to be an infinite regress. Is that the question?
Yes,
that's the question.
Adina. Tindilana Tigmido. There's Samaru Zella, Sabedruzana Mitomara, Samaru Zella, Tindiji Killa, Tarimone, and then she rebooted Chictona. Kansati Karina, Shindon, the Shindajina, Simjina, Stabasaichi, Lira. Tine, any departs who to Gudana, Parto, Suto Chena, and the Shindon Remilus. Dita Simjinji Sage. And Tine and Tanya near Tona, and Tina Lone, the Simjina, the Guda, the Namahimache, me, Mato, Tindi Potway. And Tine Tanya Tona, she named Midian. Takarlaur, that the water in the port. The Nepava part, Siru to the Nishine, any Miditirisas and machine to it. The region of Bushta. Jason, any Tamu Tondune, that Toyage dukes for other. Nick Toyage, Chick Tonga dukes. Did it Takaran touch over the motto, and the young Dava Yimai, and did the Tamashin name and that way in your touch over. Tong Takaran touch over. Dine any Simjin immediate Tamachero. And dig on the Kujoja of teaching on this and Kujoja of Tong and this and that Simjin Tong the Eddie, that's Simjin in the Denki Rula, Tanya to the Dine Tanya to the me in the Denki Rula. That Kyoji career sinner, and that Chazan washing with Chatsane, Pagi, Susu washing the Tawin, or the Imo Dotsane. Tadai Pagi, that the Midaba Levena. That the Devan Hinchina, Michela, Midaba the Nandi Gor, Mobuti Nandi, Mobuti Midaba, Nandi Gordi, Midaba in some Luchin Mida. Or a Taba, the Giton, that tiny bullet said that he did Haran CH. Did you do Zane? That Tindigi, any some Lodge Leon, and Tilla and Tiny with some machine name on the Chuduche with Charuda. Some Loran, Negutu, Mendusi, Children in Suzuki, that's some of Tani, the Midaba Maresi, in Zengi to the Chewage. Tamusum to Tonusum, that divided the Chi, Carsu, Zubuina, and as a Tandis and Nagitus detaches her. Dinner in Monina Mena, until the tiny machine never Yunaman, and that way, Nagitus does her. Then I Judy Carridu, Tiridu, Shingridu, Carridu, Ladi, Yashini and Georgie, Tajoshi Jawara, or Tiri, Tindimeno.
So with regard to this question, the question being that every time you realize something, do you need another valid cognizer that realizes the valid cognizer, etc. So here saying the following should actually be okay. So this is I gave an example of at the time of dusk, not when it's totally dark or not at the time when it's still very light. So at the time of dusk, when you see something from afar, what you may see is something elongated, something long. And then you wonder, oh, is that a tree or is that a living being? So a doubt arises. You're not really sure about it. But you do see something. Your valid cognition, your valid cognizer does realize something there. And then you go closer, and you realize that the object moves back and forth, which therefore you now know it is not a tree, it is actually a sentient being. And then when you get closer and it becomes clear to you, you then know it's not some kind of sentient being that walks on its feet, but it's actually a human being. And possibly when you get closer you come to understand it's a Tibetan. And when you come even closer and you can see it even clearer, you may understand this is a friend of yours, a companion of yours. So every time you realize something, your valid cognition does understand something. Maybe not everything about the object, but something is always realized. There's always a valid cognition realizing something. So whatever it is, you always see that there's something there, whether it's an elongated object, whether it's a sentient being, a person, or whether eventually the valid cognizer that arises is one that understands this is your friend. So you don't need to decide is this true or not. You don't really need another valid cognizer for you to decide what you see as a person, for you to see that this is a sentient being, or for you to see this as your friend. You don't need that. You're not sure in the case of not being sure whether it's a sentient being or not. You just get closer, and then when you see that it's moving, the object is moving, then you know, and in that moment, that's what you understand, that this object is actually a sentient being. But when you get really close to this person, when you get really close, and then you know it's your companion, it's your friend, but there's still so much that you don't realize about that person in that moment. You understand he or she is your friend, but for example, with regard to the impermanence of that person, for example, from the point of view of the Sautrantika school, the impermanence appears to the eye consciousness, but it's not ascertained. So then, if you want to know whether this person is impermanent or not, well then you see, well, if the person were to be permanent, is there any kind of valid cognizer that contradicts that assertion that the person is permanent? So then you start thinking, you rely on a conventional kind of valid cognizer, and in dependence on that, you then come to understand whether the person is impermanent or not. However, just with regard to perceiving something, for example, if something pricks your skin, you know that there's pain. You don't need another valid cognizer to know that there is pain. So you're just aware, you realize, you know the pain, but in case you ask, what is the cause of the pain? Was it a piece of wood that pricked me? Was it a knife that pricked me? Well then, in that case, you would need another valid cognizer that understands what was the cause of the skin being pricked. But other than that, with every valid cognizer, you do realize something there, and you do not depend on another valid cognizer that validates that perception. Is that sufficient? Is that enough?
所以照刚刚李小老的回答，就是说，如果是你的根世，那当然那个入中论里头有讲说无患根 ，OK， 就是没有错乱暂时错乱因缘所影响的根，他所见的都会是正确，都是量。这个东西等于算是一个基本假设吗？
대체체나 왕시하거나 왕시 또 아니나 염나고 말았어요.然后 강수마디 군매배 군매배 왕시 강도바디 다가랑 제마 인배 시샤체 시내 게 다기 수마디 대체 쪽이 되래 군매배 왕시 강도바디 다가랑 세마 이마 시샤체 아니 신이 다긴 겐숨 바지.
So here the question, the lady asked again, she's asking, well, what you were saying, you're talking about a sense consciousness realizing something, and so as it talks about it in the illumination, which mentions a continuum of a sense consciousness, are you here talking about not a continuum of a sense consciousness? So that kind of sense consciousness realizes the object. Are you saying that? Are you talking about not a continuum, like a continuum without being just a continuum, just a sense consciousness? Are you talking about that? And Geshe-la said yes.
所以如果是这样子的话，就是比如像前2天有举过一个例子，是他跟另外一位葛西同样听同样的录音带，你可听出来的东西不一样。可是基本上如果是这样子的话，那这2个人里头，2个都是亮吗？还是2个都不是亮？还是其中一个是亮？
其实前两年嘛，开始念啦，经济经济诉讼，经常跟工作网对杨家，搞人们切给贴的杨家年，你天内像你康年把的杨米早点就切给的，天对背着第个人路啦，经常跟工作网对康年切路，杨米那年切。澳洲给写吧，你康年嘛的米家车马的，杨洋米家车马的。
这张得给在那上，我现在往西的倒把的，往西的南往的切不，往西的有用文的做那个样，俺第一针对进来有用文的多，那个通过多了呢，第这个嘛，第倒头个嘛，现在跟我年纪的前辈搞来，讲我年辈搞来，讲我那么去这些南方的超级用语吧。第一，但少在前那这地当年过的送给吧，这他缺吧。但电脑那个这个不离切用的，安尼这电梯机，安尼那个都没都是，就他这个套了，安尼的他研究可老他的了，他头些可的呢，安尼的切我的嘛都，这个拍个这里有把的倒菜的，那常常的他那我说第一有他的了那这个一句的。你第几的在那边呢？我毕竟20个了，罗蒙不打毕竟他们的新语不走了的。那的特别些年用的在那当地嘛都去开些嘛都过嘛，就是特别这个三不时他们的这个看第几都不是这的。但假的给也不新语嘛的，假的些年吧伊呢，这个里那个有不得吃上过的，吃上可能第几多的，就是这给那个能老吃三六的。其实第几的天气个旺季，拍个这三六个套呢，这三六个套呢，安尼天气送嘛送来个，送去米朝你用谁个了？这个这送个月吧，当拍个当年过送个月吧的他缺个多，第二他的啥不需要呢？安米朝你拍去用嘛的，但去弄那啥没用那么多，去弄那啥给这些人吧，去这了，安尼这个一大个差通，电能性用那么多先，他给不把那真的。kumba la ne tsam ti ka la na mi dawa ni pheji ku ma la na amje thana yu na mi dawa ni pheji ko da ha ma le ta di ga na chi kha she be je ta na ti na lo la ne te khwe di la so chi gi yo khwe di la so mi dawa yo si ro ta ti de ta ta gi de chi ba re ta ko nang gi yo ta che ba ba ti ne mi yin ba ta che ba ba ta mi di ni ya le khari yi me 아니 코시가 약을 거리 이메 코미다바 이메 인스리야 다마시니 지용되가.
So her question was the second, then the lady she asked Geshe-la, so as you said before, when you previously went into Wonder and Geshe-la, they listened to a recording of His Holiness's teachings, and at that time they were not able to decide what did His Holiness say exactly. So they both listened to the words, but in one case, Geshe Khenpo Wonder heard something different to Geshe-la. So my question is, which of those two was a valid cognizer? So which of those two were those both valid cognizers? And Geshe-la said, well, as I explained before, what appears to a mental, what appears to a sense consciousness is not sufficient. Just the appearance is not sufficient. So for something to appear to the mind doesn't mean it's realized. So in the case of listening to His Holiness's cassette, actually we both, in both cases, whether Geshe Khenpo Wonder or myself, in both cases we knew His Thomas was talking about emptiness. So we both had a valid cognizer with regard to understanding. Thomas was speaking about emptiness. So the subject matter was totally clear, but then there were little details which were not clear in this case. So actually, Tibetan language, I would say that I know Tibetan well. I understand Tibetan well. I've spoken it for many years. However, when I listen to Tibetan songs, oftentimes the only thing I get is the melody. I get the melody, but I don't get many of the words because Tibetan language is such that when you sing it, the words are not very clear. Whereas I don't really speak much Hindi. I don't know all the Hindi words. However, when I listen to a Hindi song, due to the nature of the language, each word appears clearly to me. So there's just something about the nature of the language. In one way, in one case, the language, the words appear clearly. In another case, they do not. So if in case here the language were to appear clearly to both of us, then we would be able to understand the same thing. We would be able to hear the same thing. So this was just there was definitely we agreed on that as Honda spoke on emptiness. However, these details on what was said, it wasn't clear enough, and so we both had our own perception. And this is not the same as in the case of, for example, a human being when there's a vessel with liquid perceives water, a preta being when they receive a vessel of water perceives pus and blood, and so forth. But when we say, for example, Yimba in Tibetan, or Vas, or even clearer than that, we say ah. So just this very clear sound ah. All of us would be able to perceive the word ah. So in what exactly they're saying, etc., that may not be clear to us, but that is a bit like the example before, that what appears is an elongated space, or what appears is a sentient being. So we're clear about there being a sentient being, but in terms of some of the details, whether that sentient being is permanent or not, kind of more detailed characteristics, that we may not be able to perceive. But there's definitely a valid cognition in the sense an understanding of what basically the object is.
对天人来说是一个显现，对人来说是一种显现，那它到底是什么？那就是这个像这种部分就会有一些其他的争议。可是当你在讲尬怕什么翻译的时候，确实非常清楚。
老大给故事传播的呢，是这么这个讲，特别是看这个的进修都是那个的，Jasper，天天特别是个的，那的特别是社会面对的那个的，我就的进修都是必须切过来的那个。 파이 자자자자 아니 캔바를 마찬바 나오레스 마음지요라 근데 세워 나오레스 라니 캔바 나오레스
So Vishala has a friend, a lucky man, a lucky friend, and they sometimes kind of tease each other, they kind of playfully tease each other. And so the Ladakis, when they speak Tibetan, they pronounce the prefixes and the suffixes of each word. And so they're therefore saying, oh, when you speak Tibetan is not clear, you're not speaking properly, because it's not really clear what you're saying, because you need to also pronounce the prefixes and the suffixes. But there's one word, which is chimba, which means to know. It has the suffix ma. So if you pronounce the ma, then it becomes not knowing, ma chimba. So it becomes not knowing if you pronounce the ma, which is the suffix. So it has a suffix ma, but there's also a syllable ma when you say not knowing. So Geshe-la is saying, he's teasing him and saying, well, are you saying when you say knowing, you're saying not knowing? And the other person says, no, you don't clearly say ma, you say mu. So mu. So then it works. There's no misunderstanding.
知道的时候呢，因为你得把其他字马念出来，那你再说是知道还是不知道呢？这时候呢，这个拉达克的这个贝奇说，还是要把这个前加字念出来，然后念出来要刻意把嘴巴抿起来，这样要这样念才会清楚这样。
但这个团其实是的老外用过了，可能是那我在上面语言文用嘛嘞，那你那语言来个都，那然后呢就把那个用嘛嘞，其他用嘛嘞来个都，你起码看的是切个是，那你兴趣呢？ 这个他那个什么那个，啊啥，什么型的那个，这个什么型的那个要么第一要这个的，嘛到，但这个要这个这个嘛到，当然刚才这个到的，是吧？
So with respect to the view on emptiness, the situation is different with regard to the eye consciousness, for example, because what appears to the eye consciousness is existence from its own side. So it's not like the object appears to you directly, but rather the object appears to you, the mode of existence of phenomena appears to you incorrectly. So you cannot rely on the appearance. So if you cannot rely on the appearance, you do depend on another valid cognition of a valid cognizer, seeing is it contradicted by another valid cognizer or not, and if it is, then you can come to see, you can come to understand whether this appearance is mistaken or not.
마누에게 다 딘지 중나 참신ning 말에서기 체지 큐니 샤야 민도나 다 딘지 양다 민도스라고 그러다 제가 정말 민도스.
For example, when you think of reasons and we apply reasoning in order to understand something, so let's say we apply different logical reasons and we come to some kind of decision. But it can be that after some time, whatever decision we've come to, then we change that. After a year, we change our opinion. And then we change back again. That is possible. However, to actually attain certainty is that, well, if we may ask then, is it possible to come to some kind of certainty? Is it possible to come to some kind of decision that later on we do not change our opinion about? Well, if we look at, for example, a correct syllogism that establishes something, there is a way in which we say the predicate, we just don't see the opposite of the predicate. We don't see that there's nothing else but the predicate. So in that sense, we do not know that whatever is the reason is necessarily the predicate. In this case, we can change our opinion. It's a possibility because we don't really understand the relationship between the reason and that which it establishes. So we still have this doubt. And then we may change our views on the object. But if we understand the relationship between the reason that establishes a particular predicate, if we understand that relationship and we understand the three modes of a correct reason, or the three aspects of a correct reason, well then we don't need to see whether there is any valid cognition that harms that or contradicts that, because we can just depend on that correct reason and come to some kind of conclusion on the basis of which we do not change our opinion, we do not change our view on this matter. But if we cannot in general posit a direct kind of valid cognition or contradiction by valid cognition, if we cannot posit one in general, well then there's really no inferential cognizer. We cannot posit an inferential cognizer. We cannot posit a correct syllogism.
那在这样状况下，我们就会得到一个结论，就是没有所谓的正因的存在。
근데 세마는 이제 요 말을 나야 되는 게 라데다. 되게 변한 치료배이다. 제바부 뭐지 제바부 캐는 요르세냐 너도 요 말을 라고 해. 나베 지라마기야. 되게 지도된 루케는 데서 야 센센베 파카샤레. 야 센센베기 시바드르기야 라주베 까레 라주베 다 우마베 까레 안 파카 추카 땡키 술이지 저버렸어. 라데다. 그 디 딘시리 보마 장년지다. 하기 지다 미만한 기제디 시는 인지문다. 아니 그게래라고 지금 말해. 파일이 봤던 거, 수혜리 봤던 거 다 차샤야 민두세야지.
So some say that it's impossible independence on direct cognition to come to some kind of certainty. They say that's actually impossible. Some hold that view. They say, okay, non-Buddhists talk about a creator God. Say establish or accept the existence of a creator God. Buddhists say there is no creator God. So it's just a matter of different views. Or the Vaibhashika, they say that external phenomena exist truly. This then in turn is refuted by the followers of the Chittamatra school, who say no, phenomena do not exist truly. But then their assertion again is refuted in turn by the followers of the Svatantrika. And the view of the Svatantrika is refuted by the Prasangika school. So one could then, without relying on correct reasoning, if one were not to rely on correct reasoning, one could just go, oh yeah, they're all right, they're all kind of, it's all valid what they're saying. So this, from this perspective, it is not. So without coming to some kind of conclusion, everything is kind of okay. So some people may come to that kind of conclusion.
근데 기왕같이 요마레스 내게 요래 랑이 요래 아니 따님샹에 요래 다 차샤에 요마레 베스나 이제 랍도 말어 얘라 알레 기왕같이 요마레 랑이 주이나 딜레 거기 차샤 마샤를 그 레베디 컨데스 레기도 디타지 줘라 매번 민두란 미기 통해다 되는 요마레 그런 경쟁이 있었는데 그거 제가 경쟁이 컨데스 그거도 변한 지 경험을 지 송사 지기 인딜레기도스 기왕같이 요마레스 친이백이 매번 타지에 차레스 레기도스 딜레 경험을 지 렌드라 친이백이 기왕같이 마통을 마도 마녀버를 마도 매번 예용을 다스 렌디 되어 인스 근데 송사 디더브레다.
So with respect to, for example, past and future lives, so some people say there are no past and future lives. Some say there are past and future lives. Some just adopt a kind of in-between position, maybe yes, maybe not. So cannot decide really. So to say that there is no answer to that is actually not okay. To say that there is no answer, there is no true kind of way in which we can establish this is not okay, because it must be one of those, at least two. So therefore, how do we go about it? We should check the person who says there is no past and future life. How do they assert this? Is it just because they don't perceive past and future lives and therefore they hold this view? What are the reasons for them saying there are no past and future lives? So His Holiness says that on one occasion he said that he's met a scientist who said there are no past and future lives because science has proven there are no past and future lives. And His Holiness says, no, that's not true, that's impossible. All that happened was they haven't seen, they haven't found past and future lives, but they have not found the non-existence of past and future lives. So there's a difference, not finding something and finding that it is not existent. So there's a difference here.
지금 다 디저브지기 단다 가시를 뒤에 용디 봐. 가장 그냥 좀 나가나신다. 조지세디 강바디기들이 아니 방레디들이 텔레튼신들이 세용되잖아요. 에 파라치를 로딩을 조지디 라르는 잘 거라. 지금 조지디 많이 해봤다. 조지디를 납세지 말아라. 조지 많이 해봐. 지금 다 조지 매번 또 버렸지. 조지 매번 다 로딩 조지 매번 다 갈라오다. 짐발라오. 딘디치네. 아니 조지 민도스. 로딩 하고도 매번 딜레거데 지다 딜레는 지부지야. 그 조지디 많이 해버리면도 조지 매번 해요 말이스. 이 경쟁에 갈래서는 그 조지 유엔은 로딩이 통과해 내려. 딘디치 유엔은 통과해 명의직이 마다마치 로딩이 통과사 유엔은 제 따지지 정신체 로딩이 통과해 명의직 마통은 민도신 타지도 말이스. 아니 유엔은 제니 예고해지 로딩이 예고해 유모부지는 아니 그 마통되잖아요. 민도신 타지도 말이스. 제가 어느 유엔은 제니 예고해 매버지다. 그러면 유엔은 율기 땡니 유엔은 제니 예고해 가르랬으나 이 율기 땡니 유엔은 율기 땡도 제니 예고로 어디로 디나신 템버 유엔은 먼저 템버 이만이 세야 돼. 그니 가서 해대다 섬대의 템버이는 지정기 제외 최기 세르세르 주로 세르세르 마저지 예전은 그 템버 말했지. 템버이는 예고를 다. 제 템버마이는 준비이는 제니 예고입니다. 난 점기 뭐 보시라 这里语定的业会给明的，我的结果的说的。
So likewise, yesterday we spoke about the table. So let's take the table. The table is not the legs. The legs of the table are not the table. The surface is not the table. And there's nothing separate that exists as the table. So it exists from the side of the mind. It appears to the mind. It appears or it exists from the perspective of the mind. So then when we find it, when we look for the table among its parts, when we look for the table among its parts, we do not find something there. But not being able to, so then the mind, when it doesn't apprehend the object, it does not find the object. So we actually need to describe the mind that does not find the table as a mind that just merely doesn't find the table, but not a mind that realizes the non-existence of the table. So therefore, there's nothing unusual about a mind not finding a table if it is a mind that's not supposed to find a table. Whereas if it is a mind that is supposed to find a table but doesn't find it, well then we say the table doesn't exist. So in the first case we're saying it's a mind that is not supposed to find the table, but that doesn't mean therefore the table doesn't exist. However, if you have a mind that is supposed to find the table, that should find the table, and then doesn't do so, then we can say the table doesn't exist. Now here in this case, we're looking for a table that exists somewhere from its own side. We look for a table that exists from its own side. We're searching for a table that exists from its own side. If there were such a table that exists from its own side, we should be able to find it. Where should we be able to find it? We should find it the way it appears to be from the side of the object, from the side of the part. There we should be able to find it. And if we cannot find it, what it proves is that it doesn't exist from its own side. Likewise, the same is true for true existence. When we say something exists truly, if it were to exist truly, then the closer we looked at it, the more we talked about it, the more we thought about it, the clearer it would have to get. But when we actually look for it, when we search for it, it does not become clear. In fact, it doesn't become clear and we end up not finding anything there. So thus, the phenomenon is what's called false. And if something is false, it doesn't have to be findable. It's not something we can find. It's just a mere appearance of that object that exists.
你们这边哪有是吧？其实呢，里边对对上呢，它不有没到这边不落脚的，里边嘛对，当然同样有嘛不全，民族性他现在听不到，但对他现在没讲着，拍个地不有呢，通过一个通特别一个。 아니 되게 미싱디체 미싱던데 비다 보면 보다 단데 강들 통해 강에 채나 단데 면지 때문에 부딪혀로 당기는 지 펼주고 있는 지 이제 양교시 따지가 딘디치는 따는 민도는 다 부민도 따지고 아니 되게 다가서 부디 참고 인자네 거의 체식이 다 거의 유나 다 거기 수비 지중다 세 가리는 딘디지 유에나 디통 투비에기 아니 시고디 단단히 마통나 민두래 지다 아니 먼저 미 잡아디기 아니 통괴매 통투비에매 받아 유에네 통괴매 인상 디마통이 민두신 다지도입니다.
So for example, Geshe-la saying that in the past, Geshe-la was suffering from TB or tuberculosis. So Geshe-la was sick from tuberculosis. So he had to, his spittle had to be checked. They had to be checked, and he had to give a probe of his spittle. And then they were able to see whether the virus was present in the spittle or not. So of course, with your eyes, with your eye consciousness, you're unable to see the viruses because they're too small, they're too subtle for the eye consciousness to be able to see it. So therefore saying just because the eye consciousness doesn't see it, or the eye consciousness doesn't perceive it, there is no virus, it doesn't have TB, well that wouldn't work. You actually have to go to a hospital, and then they use a a device like a microscope, and with the microscope, you can possibly perceive the viruses, but if the microscope is not strong enough, if it is faulty or not strong enough, you may have to actually add some substance to the spicle so that the viruses will increase, that they will multiply. So when multiply, it becomes more obvious, and in that moment, you can decide whether there is whether the tuberculosis virus is there or not. And if it is not there, well, at that time, those awarenesses, those by way of the microscope and whatever other means and methods, if you then, after looking for it, you do not find it, if the mind that should be able to see it, if it was there, does not perceive it, then you can decide whether the virus is not there and you should let free from the disease. However, by merely relying on the sense consciousnesses and saying, because the sense consciousness doesn't perceive it, therefore it is not there, that is not reason enough to establish the non-existence of these viruses.
That in tuition that you do, and the direction. Nima Lujuji Tani, Paki Arilla, Arilla Paki, that choosing Tambu ladies and any Paki Demimi, Paki Yuding, Mituzuki, that choosing Nima Tonio Mara, choosing Tongo Maris, or Tindichi. Dirva. Daya Dina Shinchigita, Kato, Ifkin Toma Yungin, Tamu gets them in Longa de Yora, Longa Duzuki, and Mita Shajin, Paki Chema, Dichi Sadikala. 가도 단도서 입 단도서 통도 뭐 말했어. 통그랬어.
니 통도 이내야 니 공부를 니 가와들어서 하얀 통도 다 입단 가도도 통그러면서 완전 나신 직세고 지금 하얀 통도
입단 가도 통그래.
입단 가도 지금 대교도 지라마도 비티버도 쳤어요. 비티버도 지대내려서 큰 통도.
아 반지 어디 잡으시도 지와 디디르다. 디지디전에 다디 아니 디단 디센 통디에 디 and Tobegi Tanya Cherry Wangi in Toya base.
So another question that was asked yesterday. So in terms of the history, like when the first person, Christopher Columbus, when he arrived in America, at that time it is said that the local, the people who were already the indigenous people in America, when they stood at the beach and they were looking at these ships approaching, it is said that they didn't see the ships because they had no concept, like no sense of these ships, so they didn't see them. Likewise, there's this incident of a lady who was blind since birth, and she had never seen anything with her eyes. And then, when there was a way to cure her, she received an operation, a surgery, and upon removing the bandages, she couldn't see what we were able to see. So the objects around us that we were able to see, all she saw was a blur of shape and color. So the question is therefore, does it depend on our eye consciousness perceiving something? Does that depend on using the conventions, having imputed objects? Does that depend on that for us to be able to perceive something with our senses? Sense consciousness.
那以这个例子来说，他的问题就是，那这个人这个盲眼人乍看，开完刀他能够看清楚的看到东西的时候呢，请问他是因为明眼你分别是安利的缘故呢，才能看得到这些形状、颜色等等吗？
这个是，这个我们没讲过的。
没讲过的，咱们可能这个发现，这当我们谈一大来的，咱们罗伊谈的，罗伊谈的理想的。 자의 탄이 따서 가르쳐 그러나 디란디 원 탄이 따서 가르쳐 탄이 따서 가르쳐 그러나 자의 탄이 따바디기 그러나 본변 자의 탄이 따발라디 다야디 안에 빠바디 본바 원년 받상 대참 디기도 해서 도츠디 가르쳐 도츠디 빠바디 도츠 가르쳐 아니 단다 로에 탄이 세야디 간듯이 샤고 해서 그러나 깨리 마시긴 के मासिगी सेंचुन चुंचुन दाव चिचेना ता तोपे फाटा고 그래서라 तोपे ता야디다 다에 थानि다 노에 था니기나네 노에 था니 ता기사데스 어디 था니 독서 카르데스 아니 노에 था니 디칸데 샤고데스 아니 노에 था니 ता바데다 아니 다에 था니 ता바니라 코리미오다메 지와단다 디디레스 아니 단다 마시기 통해나 아니 야나 노에 था니 야나 다에 था니 카운시 따고 그래스 하나 빼디디레스라 다에 था니 마타와라
아니 조절로서 단데서 통마 토버스 같이 이단 카도 뒤닥시 체네 내가 아니지 내가 본바다 마다와이나 아니 밀롱와 디기다 니마 마다와를 대적이 차는 코다와를 마도 단다 이단 카도 시저시는 코다야 말아 김선 지치는 공원식이 또 들어오는데
그렇죠. 디지디 그래. 타니 가르스. 자이 타니, 르이 타니 세디 가르스. 샤다디 되게 찍어요.
So the question here, top question is, well, we talk about a convention, so we apply a convention. We have a conceptual consciousness that imputes. So what is imputed? A verbal or a mental convention? So his question is basically, what is the difference between a verbal or a mental convention? So talking about a verbal convention, well, someone who doesn't know language, does that mean they do not use verbal conventions because they don't use language, such as certain animals? So then these animals, do they only use a mental convention? And what is the way of imputing a mental convention? What does that mean to impute a mental convention? What does that refer to? And in order to be able to perceive something with your sense consciousnesses, do you have to impute? Do you have to first conceptually impute something before you're able to see it? So in the case of the lady who was blind since birth, she was able to use the tangibility of the table, for example, using that as a basis of imputation, and therefore was able to impute table. But by seeing the shape and color of the table, she had not imputed table, and so therefore, is that why she didn't see the table?
다딜라도 알랭에는 타니 기지시바이나 저희 타니에서는 밍디지로 디단 대주비 밍디지 달로이 타니에서는 디단 대원님으로 디가와레 디본바레 스파기 디로이 타니지 다다스는 디차레 당하는 기로 저희는 주바 로디를 차대 징디에.
So Nicola is saying that here when we talk about convention, so we talk about verbal convention and we talk about mental convention. So the verbal convention refers to the name, to the actual word that we use, the sound that we use. And how do we impute it? By using the sound, by just expressing the word. That would be the imputing. But how do we impute mental conventions? Well, mental conventions are imputed by thinking, oh, this is a bath, oh, this is a table. So thinking, oh, this is something else. So just thinking it, that would mean applying the verbal convention. So this is what it means to apply the verbal convention.
다 저희 타니다 루이 타니 가능을 레시에다 니바 아이. 단다 디나나 딘디지 요래. 타니에 따비 지수 뚱벌 했어야지. 뚱벌, 뚱벌스는 잘봐. 지자다 디다 디레스 뭐 den신께 용해야지. 디레스야지. 타니에 따비 왕기 아니 계용을 소리지. 다디다는 딘디 타니 디디라고지로 저희 타니 명제레다 아니 명디다 사도 아니 디왕비 아니 증거디 다 계용해. 다디 가자기니 라이디나 신기레 디베샤레 킹부레 시르레 시르직라 딘디도 그 명디다 안 디왕비 증거디 계용해. 다 딘디 많이 봐 나오니 밀로요로 나 나기도 말 딘디도서 니를 명지다 안 딘디 계고 얘기지 유지 말해. 다이네 율기기 원도 집이 명디니 슈르신이 다기로. 데르만도 지다 코랑코랑다 나오니 밀로지 다다 깨되었다.
So with respect to here the verbal convention here, and with respect to the verbal and mental convention, what is the sequence in terms of what is imputed earlier, what is imputed later? So there's different, I don't think Geshe-la is saying there's a specific sequence that one needs to go earlier, that one needs to go later. I don't think there's this kind of sequence, but Geshe-la is saying that there is this quote or this phrase in the scriptures, after having imputed a convention, one falls down. Falls down here means that then one, whatever convention has been imputed by the person, from then onwards one perceives it as truly existent. So the downfall occurs when, after one has implied the convention, there is the belief the object exists from its own side. So it's after one applies the convention, then there's a sense this is not merely a convention that was given, but that the object from its own side is such this object. So Geshe-la used the example earlier of money, for example. So you newly distribute money, or you newly appoint someone as a disciplinarian. So even though there was a new appointment, there's a sense it comes from the side of the object. Whereas from the point of view of the I, the self, so there's naturally a thought, I'm sick. So one doesn't need to have to apply the mental convention, I am this, and so forth. Of course, in terms of the verbal convention, in terms of the word, then when one learns the language, one is able to use the word, for example, in English, I. So that comes later when one learns the language.
That in long gi kato thoma tong di lai di da chuni ma thong na ani danda mi le ga ji ju ro da thong ba gang shi la dun zhu na xin le yin wai sirwe o di thong na danda kato ma thong ta che ro da din di ma yin na ji thong go ro da ko rang gi bena de da na mi zhao ji di dan mi zhao ji thong go ro da yin ne ming da xin go ma ro di mong bo re di sir bo re ming da xin go ma le ma do mi gi thong de bo zhou ro da
이 분바 임바 또 통으로요. 분바 임바 또.
제가 분바 임바를 또바간 레터라 디 분바레 디 몽보레 디 스르보레스 다 저마토마도 미기 유두 파기 민자와지 레차디 레데고 잡으러 배나 갈수 그래 밀롱아 가시 미 머신 거래 머신이 깨려되는 머신이도 깨다야나 다 딜레 다 서전 라바도 차나 머신이로 안 뭐지 깨려되는 머신이도 다 도스 다 그런 머신 뭐 가시 지어는 거 주지 다이는 미도스다 오퍼레이션 당 차리 미 쇼지 제 차리 뒤에 방을 샤샤나 계절만 쉐어체 다 통계요 미기 참아 민가에 민가 참아 통과 다 기란기 저거디 수레 간이들이 미지지지 간이들이라나 다 컷텀을다 딜레 아니 되게 미좀제 걸어서 계시 주나 아니 신이다 두고 띠띠띠띠스 그러 디마다 이 당니 딜라도 봐마로 디스를 찾는데
아니나 디난 제니 간디 디난 제니 간디 시어 가르스나 베나게나 단다 기릭 사바 마시 기릭 사바 장겐 저요나 나 단다 나 벽이 마시와체 게 벽이 캠바이 와인사 나 단다 겐 툭도 지 시미리 디 카와리 디 kum바리 송데 잠발라 니 나시 칸도야 되다 겐게 나시 칸도야 되 지버려
네 분발라는 분바세 자리 고도로다 다 분바 간이들에라나 신경들이 주주도 그래 타니 저 신경들이 타니 저마 신경들이 주주도 말아
So Geshe-la's response here to this question is with regard to the blind lady. So there was a bit of a discussion, but to translate this, so with regard to the blind lady, when she was able to see now, when she saw, for example, colors and shapes, so Geshe-la is saying actually she saw the same as everyone else was seeing. So of course when we talk about an animal, that we have established this animal does only see colors black and white. So of course the kind of spectrum of colors is not there for that animal, but other than that, if it's some a living being like ourselves, when we see something, then we see the same thing. So this is actually a table, this is actually a pot, this is actually something else. So therefore, we see the same thing in that moment. But, and then I asked Geshe-la, well, doesn't the eye consciousness perceive this is a vase? This is something, and Geshe-la said, no, this is